Hello and welcome back to the Berean Principle. I am your host, Reverend Nick. Last time we looked at John 1, 6 through 8 as a whole, and now we're going to slow back down and start with verse 6, which says, "There was a man sent from God whose name was John." And before we go any further, we need to clear something up. The John being introduced here is John the Baptist. He is not the same John as the one who wrote this gospel. John the Baptist is the man being described here in the story. John the Apostle is the traditional author of the gospel that we're reading. So, who is then John the Baptist? Well, John's gospel doesn't give us his birth story, but Luke's gospel does. John's parents were Zachariah and Elizabeth. Zachariah was a priest, and Elizabeth was a descendant of Aaron. They were both old, and they had no children. Then, while Zachariah was serving the temple, the angel Gabriel appeared to him and announced that Elizabeth would have a son. And before John was even born, God had already given him a mission. Gabriel said that John would go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to prepare a people for him. And that wasn't coming out of nowhere. Hundreds of years earlier, Isaiah had spoken about a voice crying in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." And Malachi spoke about a messenger who would prepare the way before the Lord. So when John 1:6 says that John was sent from God, that's not just a nice way of saying John was a religious teacher. John's ministry was part of something God had been promising for generations. He was sent to prepare the way, and even the way John appeared would have reminded people of the prophets. Matthew tells us that John wore clothing made from camel's hair and a leather belt around his waist. And that sounds strangely familiar to a description of Elijah in 2 Kings. And that's important because Gabriel had already said John would minister in the spirit and power of Elijah. But John wasn't sent to make people fascinated with John. His entire ministry pointed beyond himself. When people eventually ask him who he is, John points them back to Isaiah. And when he sees Jesus, he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who would take away the sin of the world." That's the man John 1:6 just introduced, a promised messenger, a voice preparing the way, a man sent from God, whose entire purpose was to point people towards someone greater than himself. And next time, verse 7 is going to tell us exactly what God sent him to do. That is to bear witness to the light so that people might believe. But hey, don't take my word for it.